Hello everyone, welcome to Curiosity. This week's topic is Sanskrit. So, for the last couple of months, I've been reading a lot about Sanskrit. The reason for my interest actually stemmed from a series of lectures given by Professor K. Ramasubramanian from IIT Kanpur. The thesis for his lectures, more or less, is that there has been a lot of scientific work that was done in the Sanskrit language right around the time when a lot of the fundamental math was being developed in Europe. Now, regardless of the historicity, etc., it just was interesting to me because I'd never actually known that Sanskrit was used for things other than bhajans and kirtans and things like that, right? So I didn't ever, I suppose, realize the utilitarian perspective of that language. And it got me thinking, and it got me started down this rabbit hole of finding out what exactly are these scientific works and like if there is anything that is applicable to today's day and age. So that was interesting, and I started doing that digging, and I found out that there were a lot of topics in especially calculus and continued fractions, which were things that I really loved as a school kid in 11th and 12th, right? So continuous fraction is something like 1 divided by 1 plus 1 divided by 1 plus 1 divided by 1 plus to infinity, right? So that's an interesting number. So the question is, does it converge? Yes. And to what value? And that's something that you can find out as an exercise. But regardless, these continued fractions appear time and again as approximations to very interesting numbers like pi, e, etc., right? So I think, honestly, like the first time I saw this as a Sanskrit verse, I was blown away. Second thing is, I was also very interested in knowing why is it that it took me so long to realize that these things were actually a part of Sanskrit literature. So I started looking back into how I was taught Sanskrit when I was in 6th class and 7th class and so on, right? This was CBSE syllabus, mind you, so other syllabi might have something else, but in CBSE, typically Sanskrit was taught more from a poetic standpoint, more from a moral education standpoint, things that you would typically expect in literature, non-detail type of work. And that's very interesting because that division between arts and sciences is, if you think about it, a relatively modern development. And to be more specific, it's actually a modern European development. So it is kind of interesting. So if you look at temple architecture is a very common example that I typically provide to people when I try to describe to folks out in the West that in India, sciences and arts are not as clearly separated as they are in the West. And most of that is because there is no inherent incompatibility with the natural philosophy that exists in religion as well as natural philosophy that exists in scientific understanding. So because of this artificial split, I suppose somewhere down the line, the people who were making the syllabus for CBSE saw Sanskrit as a quote-unquote language, and they started viewing it purely as a means for constructing poems, disseminating moral education as a humanities branch, if you will, and not necessarily a scientific branch. Now that's also strange for another reason, because if you think about how Sanskrit is actually structured, it's structured using the syllables that you can pronounce and in a very specific way. And I've been reading or rereading some basics on Sanskrit to just get myself up to speed. And the very first lecture in a series of courses by a very renowned Sanskrit scholar whom I'll post and mention the links down below, said that the structuring of the consonants in Sanskrit goes this way. And anybody who speaks any Indic language like Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, etc. would know the structuring of consonants is ka, cha, ta, ta, pa. So if you notice that, it's ka, cha, ta, ta, pa. So it starts from your throat and ends at your lips. So if you say it again, ka, cha, ta, ta, pa, it's a progression. It's very clear progression from the back to the front. So it's a very ordered, scientifically structured language, and there is no consonant between ka and cha, if you think about it. And I challenge you to kind of pronounce anything between ka and cha. Similarly, there's nothing between cha and ta. After cha, there is ta. If you try to make a sound in between cha and ta, you'll get stuck. So the point being, when we look at Sanskrit as a language, and the fact that it is, one, scientifically created, two, has produced a lot of output in the field of science, it is only after several years after graduation do I come to know that there are these things hidden in Sanskrit literature. I wish I knew them sooner. The reason I say that is because when you study, for example, the concept of limits, right? You cannot relate to limits very well as an Indian student, because you start manipulating these algebraic notations. I mean, if everyone remembers that f of x plus h minus f of h divided by h, where h goes to 0, and f is that function that you're kind of seeking, the limit, seeking the value of as the limit goes to 0. Now, the interesting thing is, this version of a limit is not how limits are actually introduced in Sanskrit literature. They're actually introduced in a very, again, utilitarian sense, right? So if you wanted to calculate the area of a circle using integrals, how would you do that, right? And there is a concept of limit involved there as well. So this infinitesimal concept comes in very early in Sanskrit literature, and it would be great if, for example, a text in Sanskrit containing a component of scientific understanding along with the moral and the art and the other literature type of education. And this is not done today. And I don't know why that is. I think obviously one can pick a lot of holes with this, the way CBSE syllabus was covered, and they are also changing now for the better. For example, history textbooks did not have a lot of history on southern Indian empires, which were pretty stable during and after the Mughal era. Now that's changing. So hopefully at some point the Sanskrit language textbook in CBSE would also move towards a direction which is more true to the Indian philosophy, which doesn't quite demarcate arts and sciences as severely as the Western education system does. So that's an interesting observation for this week. Of course, the second point about Sanskrit, which I also found a bit troubling, is that of late people have started in mainstream academic discourse referring to Sanskrit as in the same way that you would refer to Latin, for example. And I think that's a bit unfortunate, because I think what that does is it kind of forces us to put Sanskrit in a museum when it can actually be very easily learnt. Now, once again, there are a series of lectures that I'm going to post down below for people that are interested in learning Sanskrit, and I hope that people can overcome the associated taboo of learning Sanskrit, because it's somehow related to mainstream Hinduism or something like that. I mean, if you just put it all aside and just view it as purely a language, it's actually quite good and very interestingly structured and very thorough. So not to mention, of course, a lot of the Indian languages derive a lot of the root words from Sanskrit. So if you go into the meaning of what Sanskrit is, it is Samskrutam, right? So well done. So that's what it translates to. Of course, there is another word that is commonly heard in historical context. It's called Prakrit, which is more the people's language, so to speak. And there are some languages that are purely Prakrit still, but they are in a minority. I was studying, for example, what the Telugu language was, and I was of the opinion that it was maybe Prakrit, and it is not. So Telugu language, for example, is called Vikrit. So what it is it's a mixture of Sanskrit and Prakrit. So it has a lot of local words, but in addition to that, it has a lot of Sanskrit root words as well. So I would encourage all of you Indians out there to look into your own languages and see where the commonalities are, because it's very important. It's one of those things that I hope doesn't die with our generation, like many things are likely to. And on that note, I'll end this talk.